In June of 1893, on a green hillside above the Musselshell River in Montana, a rancher named Elias Ward drove his spade into the earth beside a dead man's grave and heard it ring against tin. He had not meant to dig there. The spring flood had gnawed the hill half away, and he was only shoring up a neighbor's family plot the way a man does when the neighbor is a widow, and the dead man was once his friend. But the sound that came up out of that ground was not the sound of stone. It was the sound of a secret. And when Elias Ward knelt and lifted a small tobacco tin out of the dirt, 6 years of buried silence came up with it, and nothing in the Musselshell Valley would ever sit quiet again. Before we ride on, if stories of the old frontier speak to something in you, stories of hard land and harder choices, take a breath now and join us by subscribing so the trail doesn't end here. What was folded inside that tin was written in a woman's hand, and it was never meant to be read by the living. To understand what Elias found, you have to go back to the winter that broke Montana. The old-timers called it the Great Die-Up, the winter of 1886 and 87, when the snow came in October and never let go, when cattle froze standing against fence lines and the Chinook wind arrived too late to save anything but grief. Elias Ward was 39 that winter, a lean, quiet man who had come up the trail from Texas with nothing and built a modest spread on the north bank of the river. His nearest neighbors were the Doyles, Thomas Doyle, big and loud and lucky, and his wife Margaret, who was none of those things and was worth more than all of them put together. Margaret Doyle had come west from Ohio as a schoolteacher and married Thomas in the spring of 1880, in the little white church at Cairo with the whole county watching. She was a straight-backed woman with dark hair going early to iron, careful with words the way some people are careful with money, as though she had learned young that words spent wrong could not be gotten back. She kept the Doyle Ranch's books, doctored its calves, taught her boy Toby his letters by lamplight, and once rode 11 miles through an April sleet to sit up with Elias's dying mother because no one else would come. Elias never forgot that. He had loved Margaret Doyle quietly and hopelessly since before she was a Doyle at all, and he had buried that feeling the way you bury anything on the frontier, deep and without a marker. Thomas Doyle died in the last blizzard of that terrible winter, in March of 1887. He rode out to pull cattle from the coulees along Coulter Creek and his horse came home without him. They found him 2 days later under 4 feet of snow, frozen not a mile from his own barn. The county turned out for the funeral. Margaret stood at the graveside on the hill above the river, holding 8-year-old Toby's hand, her face like a closed door. And Elias, standing back among the men with his hat in his fists, watched her do a strange thing. When the prayers were done and the crowd had started down the hill, Margaret knelt at the open grave, alone, and dropped something small into the earth beside the coffin. Folks who saw it said it was a letter, a farewell from a grieving wife, and wasn't that a tender thing? Nobody asked. On the frontier you did not ask a widow about her grief. For 6 years after that, life went on the way life does. Margaret ran the Doyle Ranch herself and ran it well, better than Thomas ever had, though the bank in Cairo made her fight for every season's credit, because she was a woman alone. Elias helped where she'd allow it, which was seldom, and they settled into the careful friendship of two proud people who each believed the other deserved better company. Toby grew tall, the valley healed, and then came the flood of 1893, when the Musselshell rose brown and violent and ate 30 feet of the hillside where Thomas Doyle lay buried, and Margaret rode to town on a Tuesday to fight the bank once more, and Elias took his spade up that hill to do a kindness and struck tin. He should have put it back. He knew that even as his thumb pried the rusted lid. He told himself later that he only meant to see whether the flood had ruined whatever tender thing she'd buried, whether it could be saved for her. But that was a lie, he told himself, and Elias Ward was not in the habit of lying, so it didn't sit well. Inside the tin, wrapped in oilcloth dry as the day it was written, was a single letter in Margaret's small upright hand. It was addressed to no one, it began. To whoever God appoints to find this, for I have not the courage to hand it to any living soul. Elias read it standing over the grave of the man it condemned. On the 4th night of November 1886, Margaret had written, "My husband Thomas Doyle came home past midnight with blood on his coat that was not his own. He told me he had settled the water quarrel at Coulter Creek. He told me John Rankin would not be moving the survey stakes again, nor doing anything else again in this world. He said it plain, the way he said everything, and then he ate his supper. I want it known that Thomas Doyle shot John Rankin from horseback in the dark, and that the man they took for it, Gideon Pruitt, never did it and never could have. For whatever Gideon Pruitt is, he is not a killer. And I have known it every day of the trial and every day since. I have let an innocent man go to territorial prison to keep my husband from the rope and my son from a murderer's name. God forgive me. I could not send this while Thomas lived, and now that he is dead I find I cannot send it at all, for the truth would take from my boy the only thing his father left him that is clean, so I bury it with the man who made me carry it. Let the same ground hold us both to account. Margaret Doyle, March 1887. Elias Ward stood on that hillside a long time, with the river talking below him and the letters shaking, very slightly, in his weathered hands. He remembered John Rankin, a freighter and small rancher, found shot dead on the creek road in the fall of '86, his survey stakes scattered. He remembered the trial in the county courthouse, remembered Gideon Pruitt, a sharp-tongued hired man who had quarreled with Rankin over wages in front of half the town not a week before, remembered how the circumstances had stacked against Pruitt like cordwood. No alibi, a grudge, a borrowed rifle. Sheriff Harlan Bell had made the arrest. The jury had taken 40 minutes, and the judge, in a mercy nobody asked for, had given Pruitt life in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge instead of the rope. Elias remembered thinking, at the time, that it had all gone very fast. He remembered, too, being grateful it was over, because the county had been an inch from lynching somebody, anybody, and a trial was better than a rope over a cottonwood limb. 6 years. Gideon Pruitt had been 6 years in Deer Lodge for a bullet Thomas Doyle fired, if he was even still alive. Now, here is where a man's road forks, and every man who has ever held a dangerous truth in his hands knows the feeling. Elias could put the letter back in the ground. The flood dirt would cover it, Margaret would never know, Toby Doyle would grow up the son of a frozen hero, and one bitter stranger would rot forgotten behind stone walls 200 miles west. Or he could carry the letter down the hill and burn down the lives of the two people he cared for most in this world. He put the tin in his coat. He told himself he had not yet decided anything. That was the second lie, and he knew it. He rode to Cairo the next morning, but not to Margaret. He went to the telegraph office at the railroad depot, and he sent a wire to the warden's office at Deer Lodge asking after the health and disposition of one Gideon Pruitt, convicted 1886, Meagher County. The answer came back before noon, in the flat, cruel brevity of the wire: Pruitt living, lungs failing, Presson, gives him to winter. Consumption. The stone walls were finishing what the jury started, and they were nearly done. Elias stood outside the depot with the yellow flimsy in his hand and watched the eastbound freight take on water, and he understood that the ground had shifted under him. A buried truth is a sin that can wait. A dying man cannot. If Gideon Pruitt died behind those walls in December, then everyone who had ever touched this thing, Thomas who fired the shot, Margaret who kept the silence, and now Elias who held the proof, would own a piece of that death forever. He rode out to the Doyle place at dusk, when the light goes long and gold across the buffalo grass, and found Margaret on the porch shelling peas, and he set the tobacco tin on the rail between them without a word. He watched her recognize it. He watched 6 years of held breath go out of her all at once, and her hands go still in the bowl, and something behind her eyes close like a storm shutter. "You read it," she said. It was not a question. "The river took the hillside," Elias said. "I was setting the plot to rights. I struck it blind, Margaret, I swear that much. But you read it. I read it." She set the bowl down with terrible care, the way a person does when they want very much to throw something. "Then you know what I am," she said. "You've known me 13 years, Elias Ward, and now you know me." "I know Gideon Pruitt is dying at Deer Lodge," Elias said. "Consumption. Warden's doctor gives him till winter." He watched that land on her like a blow she hadn't known. Whatever she had imagined all these years, Pruitt enduring, Pruitt outliving it, some far-off day of reckoning that never had to be today. It broke apart on the porch rail between them. "He can die in there with your husband's crime on his name," Elias said, quiet. "Or he can die free under open sky with it lifted. That letter's the difference. You wrote it. Seems to me you always knew somebody would read it. You just wanted God to choose the day instead of you." For a moment he thought she would strike him. Then Margaret Doyle did the thing he never expected. She laughed, one short, broken sound, and pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth, and when she spoke her voice had rust in it. "You think I never tried," she said. "You think I sat on this like a hen on an egg for 6 years and never once tried to do right." And there on the porch in the failing light, she told him the part she had not written down. The part that changed everything. 2 weeks after Thomas went in the ground in April of 1887, Margaret had ridden to Cairo and walked into Sheriff Harlan Bell's office and told him the truth to his face, every word of it. Thomas's confession, the blood on the coat, all of it. And Harlan Bell, big, respected Harlan Bell, 20 years wearing the star, the man who had arrested Pruitt and testified against him and shaken the jurymen's hands, had listened to the whole of it, And then he had leaned across his desk and told her gently, the way you'd talk to a frightened horse, to go home and never speak of it again. The case was closed, he said. The county was at peace. Thomas was dead and beyond any court's reach, so no justice could touch the guilty. Only the innocent were left to bleed. Reopen it, he said, and here is what happens. The widow Doyle stands before a good judge as an accessory who hid a murder through a whole trial and likely goes to prison herself. The boy Toby loses his mother to the law and his father's name to the newspapers in a single season, and the bank takes the ranch before the snow flies. And the Rankin family, who had found what peace a verdict gives, gets it all torn open again. All of that, Bell said, to move a crime from one dead man's ledger to another's, because Pruitt, he told her, would likely be pardoned in a few years anyhow. Once tempers cooled, he'd see to it quietly. She was to think of her son, she was to go home. And I went home, Margaret said. God help me. Elias, I was 29 years old with a fatherless boy and a mortgaged ranch, and the sheriff of this county looked me in the eye and told me the truth would eat my child. So I went home. And every year I told myself Harlan would get Pruitt his pardon like he said. And every year there was no pardon, and I stopped going to town more than I had to, because I could not stand to pass that office. The dark came down on the porch while Elias turned it over. So it was not only a widow's silence, it was the county's own law that had buried this, and buried it twice, once at trial, once in that office. And that raised the question that would carry them both into the fire. Why? Why would Harlan Bell, hearing a confession that proved he'd caged the wrong man, choose the lie? Charity for a widow, maybe. Shame at his own mistake, maybe. Or something with more weight to it. Elias thought about the fall of 1886, and about how fast that trial had run, and about one small thing he had never had reason to remember until now. That in the spring of 1887, right after the die-up ruined half the stockmen in the county, Sheriff Harlan Bell had paid off the note on his home quarter section in cash money, when better men were losing everything. Folks had called it thrift. Elias, all at once, did not. He rode to Cairo 2 days later and found Bell where you always found him at evening, alone in his office with the lamp lit, older now, 60 and thick and gray, his star polished the way other men keep a conscience. Elias laid the letter on the desk. He watched the old sheriff read it, and he watched his face, and what he saw there was not surprise. It was recognition. It was a man greeting a ghost he'd been expecting for 6 years. She told you, Bell said at last. The letter told me. She told me the rest, what you told her in this room. Elias kept his voice level. Now you'll tell me the part she doesn't know. Thomas Doyle paid you, didn't he, in the fall of '86 before the trial. That's why it ran so fast. That's why Pruitt's lawyer never found a witness worth spit. That's how a sheriff pays off his land in cash in the worst spring this territory ever saw. The lamp hissed. Outside, a wagon rolled past and faded, and Harlan Bell, who had carried it long enough that maybe he was tired, did not deny it. What he said was worse because it was human. Thomas Doyle had come to him that November with money and a threat braided together. The money for looking hard at Pruitt and nowhere else, and the threat that if Bell ever looked elsewhere, Thomas would swear the bribe had been Bell's own demand and take the sheriff down the mountain with him. I told myself Pruitt might have done it anyway, Bell said, and his voice was gravel. I told myself that right up until the widow sat in that chair and took it away from me. After that, I told myself I was protecting her and the boy, and that one I could mostly believe, so I kept it. You want to know what a man's soul dies of, Ward? It ain't the big lie. It's the little mercies he wraps it in. Looked up, and his eyes were old and flat. That letter convicts her as sure as it frees Pruitt, accessory after the fact. You take it to Judge Amherst in Helena. Maybe they pardon a dying man, and maybe they send a widow to prison to balance the books because the law does love its balance. You ready to buy one with the other? Leave it buried. Doyle's dead. I'll be dead soon enough. Let the ground keep it. And there it was, the choice with no clean side. Elias rode home in the dark with the letter against his chest like a hot coal. Justice for Pruitt might mean prison for Margaret. Silence for Margaret meant a caged death for an innocent man. Any road he chose, somebody he had no right to sacrifice got sacrificed. He did not sleep. At first light there was a horse in his yard, and it was Margaret's, and she stood on his steps with her jaw set like a woman walking to the gallows, and she said the words that decided everything. I'm going to Helena, she said. Myself, not the letter. Me, I'll stand in front of the judge and say it with my own mouth every word and take what the law gives. I buried the truth in the ground because I hadn't the courage to hold it in my hands. You dug it up. I think God appointed you, Elias, same as I asked him to. I'll not let a man die in a cell for my family's sin. Not for the ranch, and not, her voice caught the first crack in 13 years, not even for Toby, because I've been raising that boy on his father's clean name. and it's counterfeit money, and someday he'd learn what it cost, and he would hate me right instead of loving me wrong. Then I'm riding with you, Elias said. And so is Harlan Bell if I have to rope him to the saddle. His testimony corroborates yours, and it cuts against himself. A judge weighs that. They took the train from the Caro Depot on a hot morning in July, the three of them, the widow, the rancher, and the old sheriff who in the end had not needed the rope. Something in him had been waiting 6 years for permission to confess. And when Elias stood in his office and offered it, Bell had taken off the star, laid it on the desk, and said, "Well, let's go be hanged then," in the voice of a man laying down a load. In Helena, in a chamber that smelled of ink and cigars, Judge Theodore Amherst heard it all. The letter read aloud in Margaret's steady, breaking voice. Bell's confession of the bribe, given flat and complete, sparing himself nothing. Elias's account of the flood and the tin. The judge was silent a long while. Then he said that the territory of Montana had become a state with a great deal of old dirt under its new floors, and that he had discretion, and that he intended to use it. Gideon Pruitt would be pardoned by the governor's hand inside the week. Harlan Bell would face the law's judgment for the bribe, and did, and served his 2 years without appeal, and folks said he stood straighter going into prison than he ever had wearing the star. And Margaret Doyle, weighing her attempt to confess in 1887, the sheriff's suppression of it, and her voluntary surrender now, was bound over and released on the judgment of time served, for the judge remarked that 6 years of that particular silence was a harder sentence than any he had authority to impose. They brought Gideon Pruitt home in August on the same railroad, in a suit the county bought him because his old clothes had rotted in a prison storeroom. He was 41 and looked 60, whittled down to breath and bone, but his eyes were clear. He had every right to hate them all. Margaret stood on the depot platform to meet him because she would not let anyone do it for her, and the whole town watched, and she said, "Mr. Pruitt, I am the reason for all of it, and I've no right to ask your pardon, so I won't. But I have a room and clean air off the river, and a debt I mean to pay for whatever days you'll allow me." And Gideon Pruitt looked at her a long, long moment, this woman who had both damned him and, in the end, freed him, and he said in a voice ruined by stone dust and winter, "Ma'am, I spent 6 years learning exactly what a man can carry and keep walking. Appears you've been in the same school." He took the room. Toby, 15 now and reeling from the truth of his father, found in the dying man an unaccountable friend. Pruitt taught the boy to braid rawhide and told him, once the only sermon he ever gave, "Your name's yours, son. Nobody hands it to you and nobody takes it. You cut it fresh every morning." Gideon Pruitt died in the first week of December, free, in a bed by a window that looked at the crazy mountains, with snow coming soft over the valley, and by his asking they buried him on the hill above the Musselshell, on the far side of the plot from Thomas Doyle, with the whole width of the family ground between them, which Pruitt himself near the end had said was close enough for forgiveness and far enough for honesty. The Rankin family got the truth that autumn too, and it was bitter and it was better, the way truth generally is. John Rankin's widow came to Margaret's gate once in October, and the two women stood on opposite sides of it for a spell, and no one ever knew all that was said, but at the end the widow Rankin reached over the rail and touched Margaret's sleeve before she drove away. And in that country, in that year, that was a treaty signed. On a bright cold morning after Pruitt's burial, Elias found Margaret up on the hill with paper and ink and a stone. She had written one last letter, and she did not bury this one. She waited it open on Thomas's grave, where the wind could turn its pages and the sky could read it, and Elias never asked what it said. And she never told him, though in time, in a year, in the little white church at Caro, with Toby standing up beside them. He would have the rest of his life to wonder. From the river road that winter, travelers looked up and saw a strange and lasting picture. Two graves at opposite ends of a windswept plot, a young cottonwood planted new between them, and a single white page pinned open beneath a stone, fluttering like a caught bird that no one ever again intended to bury. If you've stayed with us to the end of this trail, we'd like to know your heart on it. Should Elias Ward have put that tin back in the ground and let the dead keep their peace? Or was digging up the truth worth the price everyone paid? And Margaret, coward or the bravest soul in the valley? Tell us in the comments. We read them by lamplight, so to speak. And if stories like this one of buried letters, hard justice, and the long road to forgiveness on the American frontier are the kind you want more of, subscribe and ride with us. There are more graves on more hillsides, and every one of them is keeping something. Until next time, keep your name clean and cut it fresh every morning.